I have on occasion found myself here saying of someone, there's no need for any introduction to, which there evidently is, because you're introducing something like the professor of technical studies from Tübingen Hochschule. You just can't find a piece of paper on which he'd written his biographical details. This truly is, on the other hand, kind of no redundancy in saying that there is no need to introduce Peter Cook. There's no need to introduce Peter Cook. There is simply the demand that we welcome him back.
This is an interesting fortnight, obviously, and I'm amazed that so many of you apparently keep coming night after night and day after day, and will undoubtedly suffer from informational overload. And I am really seriously aware of the significance of the method which you're using to arrive at a new future for the AA. And one is, of course, extremely conscious of the special place that it has in the history of architecture education, although most people who are involved, the students usually, their concern is to get the hell out and move on, or at least it is in some places. But there is this strange and arcane heritage that the AA has. And I have been involved in a situation where architectural education cannot be taken lightly. It's actually quite a fragile tradition. Certainly in universities it is fragile. And it's a fragile tradition intellectually because nobody is quite sure, even those who say that they are, as to whether it is actually a kind of philosophical or intellectual pursuit, or it's just craft made modern. And there is a memorandum circulating in London at this moment, which I saw about 4 days ago, that tells us that in fact Cambridge is about to ditch the whole of its School of Architecture, not just the diploma course. And Christine and I the other night were party to reading this, and it's extraordinary that whether you think that what Cambridge does is worth bothering about, it is deeply significant that such a place can just be dismissed. And that fragility, therefore, is very, one is very aware of it in the British context. But not just in the British context. There are a number of places worldwide in which there are funds which are not used to replace professors, where classes are made larger, where economies are made and streamlining. And in fact, in this country, for those who are interested, there are an increasing number of architecture schools that are not even run by architects, or even by people remotely to do with architecture. And there are, I think, currently about 5 headships. Not that that should worry you, but there are 5 headships going begging because nobody, and there's somebody sitting in the front row who probably could tell you much more about that aspect of things. And yet, the business of teaching is in itself a wonderful tradition, and that architecture schools are extraordinary animals. They have to be treated, particularly this one, I think, has to be treated with sensitivity and with intelligence. What I think is interesting about the, I was about to say the Bartlett, what's interesting about the A is that it is neatly poised between the cultures of Europe and what I will loosely call the anglo-saxon culture, although after the election results today I'm not quite sure whether we want to acknowledge the other lot. And I'm also well aware that this whole business cannot be attacked as that of being a standard scenario. There is no standard scenario, even for the boring schools of architecture, as a matter of fact, and certainly not this one. Formulaic solutions are not appropriate. And I have sat on a number of committees at different times where what was talked about endlessly was the structure of the curriculum and the structure of the responsibilities of the staff, or the structure of the responsibility of research, or whatever it might have been. And in the end, it's all bullshit, because a good school is a good school for a number of strange reasons. One also has to be sensitive from the outside, and I suppose, having not given a lecture here for 14 years, but having previously to that worked here every day for about, 25 years, one is a sort of outside, inside outsider. And one has to remember from the outside how sensitive the AA feels about itself and its unique form of government. I'm not going to go on like all evenings like that, because it would get very boring, and you know that's what one's about, really. So I'm going to carry straight on with some goodies. And I've written a sort of funny story, which is apocryphal, but also in a curious way true. My God, what's happening? This bus is parked outside the A. What the hell was going on for this bus to be parked? Well, you see, it had its change, and it had got its new chief beak and all of that. And this particular person, who I will euphemistically call Otto, which won't mean anything to those of you except those with extremely long memory, and he had a hole in the head, or a dent in the head, and I don't think he's not really the Otto that I'm using. This new incumbent thought that it would be a very good idea to engage with some of the hinterland, some of the schools up and down the island, and suggested that Saturday mornings would be in fact, did this once, long ago, but suggested that Saturday mornings would be a great time to have things happening in the A, and they could come down in buses from, Newcastle and Penzance and Zagreb and places like that. So they came, and here they were. Of course, they didn't really look like AA students. They're a bit more scruffy, and a lot of them are English. And the thing you have to know about with English students is that they're not only they're scruffy, but they're a bit lippy. They're more contentious. They don't sort of sit and they say "fuck off," and just leave and stuff like that. And so I think there's a certain sense of, oh my God, what are these people in woolly hats and things? And they came wanting to see what there was to see, and they were sort of satisfied, that indeed they got what they came for, and it was delightful in its own way. What they didn't expect, because things had started to move quite quickly, was that there was some pretty hot conversation. There was a very explosive jury going on. Things were being said that wouldn't have. The last two times I've only been on juries here twice in the last 10 years. Both of them, I have to admit, were rather anodyne occasions. Everyone was terribly polite. We were only allowed about 3.5 minutes to say anything, and then you had to politely. That is not what jurors are about. Jurors are either extremely noisy, or extremely informative, or are like wonderfully, wonderfully played impromptu string quartets. Some of the best juries I've been on have been exactly like the passing of a theme from the viola to the second violin, and then some, blah, 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 all that. Not, or they can be hellholes, useful hellholes, or of course they can be coerced to be hellholes. Anyway, so these new students decided they didn't go back to where they'd come from. Of course, that's always the purpose of the exercise. They didn't go back to Newcastle, Zagreb, etc. And Otto, he to be seen shadowily on the right. They were the first lot of people that he engaged with. Clearly, this was not a bad idea. And one of the ideas they came up with: why don't we get the hell just not totally out of Bedford Square, but let's get up the road. And there was a proposal made to have. I will use the term shop as a sort of euphemism. Shop meaning outstation, show-off place, hut. And they decided to go up to Kingsland Road, which some of you will know, the main street in Hackney, which lines up with the Gherkin, which is, where it's at this week, I was told last week. But of course, it was a bit over-styled. I'm not quite sure whether it got kicked in after a month or two. But at least the idea was great, to take a piece of the elegance and the decorum and the knowledge and the fruit of the up into the real London. The fact that initially it gets it a little bit arch and didn't matter at all, really. And I then introduced some people that started to come, or maybe they were all around. This lady who comes from Darmstadt, we will call her Lisa Kraufeld, and of course she had done a postgraduate study in the AA, and so it was, again, a sort of inside-outsider. And she's a cool lady, and she had involved in various things along the way. And in fact, her own taste moved towards a kind of Dutch diagrammatism, borrowed from Bruce Mauer. And that's all right, I suppose. And I think she was one of the first people to discuss, she said, perhaps we should, this unit business, it has been for 40 years. This is not good. And so she was all for getting rid of it. Why not? Why not, I say, all the time. And she discovered that there were other things. She developed this plan. She moved slightly off her sort of postgraduate heritage here and started to be interested very much in a certain sort of straight architecture. She discovered a Mancher Williams's city, and Mancher Williams takes a bit of discovering, but once you do, you enjoy. And then she went further. She said, perhaps we want a certain kind of rugged modesty to take. And this always worked. A German explaining this to an English audience, of course, goes well, but explaining it to an international audience also is not bad. And she moved, and even there was the really hot discussion in the A, a few months into this, was actually that William Worcester was, of course, the key American architect of the period between 1940 and 1980. I mean, that actually I'm tempted to say Worcester, but of course I say Worcester. William Worcester was really a great significance, and that this modesty is to be discovered here, there, and there. William Worcester as hero, I think, is an extraordinary thing. Of course, it is only Europeans who can have a romanticism vis-a-vis America of former times. Perhaps again after today's events, this romanticism will become all that we've got left. The New Deal and William Worcester and all that is a long, long way away, I think. And I introduce you now to Harold Smith, Hank Smith. Of course, he's a cool guy. He's at Cincinnati and then at Penn, and found his way here. Cool. Expected to... And certainly quite literate. Certainly extremely literate. Somebody who give Mark Cousins even a run for his money in his own rather dry way. Not Mark, I mean. And Hank advocates, as it emerges, that history and theory should have their own studio unit. But that they want a studio. Even if nobody else has a studio, they want a studio, because they are, after all, concerned with theory. But, of course, he was extremely literate with all that has been going on, and particularly if it's Australian, and extremely literate. And Hank believes that design has really to go to text, and all his jury notes and all his tutorial notes are worked through, so that don't be taken in by the electronics. In fact, he's an extremely serious young man. And it emerges that Wittkower returns, not since the days of Smithson, I think. Wittkower returns as standard essential reading within the corridors. Various editions of Vitruvius have to be known by any of Hank's students. Why not, I ask. But it then really pans out that he is a Rossi revivalist. This is really the bottom line. And in fact, the Rossi revival, starting in this room, moves very quickly to the schools of architecture of Lille, Canterbury, and Strathclyde. because of Hank's various circle of friends. And this is important. I mean, it is inevitable. Now, Otto, meanwhile, isn't in no way a fan of this kind of stuff, but he enjoys that Hank is on a roll. He enjoys that Hank is making this position between the true academic and the studio, and rolls with it, though he doesn't personally go for Aldo Rossi and doesn't know much about Vitruvius really, though he pretends he does. Now, inevitably there's a reaction. Well, a sort of reaction. I mean, you know, a school like this is big enough to take several moments, and one isn't sure whether one's saying that the smoke goes off in contradistinction to Hank's position, or it just happened to go off on that day when Hank was giving his major Rossi presentation, complete with dug-up models and so on. One isn't sure. Curious, but it coincided with the fact that there's a certain sort of penchant for making architectonic statements and then exploding them, fragmenting, having them in total firmness, and then something else happening. Oh, and colour seemed to have returned to the A, mysteriously. On the back of this, do we ask? On the back of this confrontation? I'm not sure. Maybe it was just inevitable. Again, at no point does Otto seem to have invoked that colour should return. There's no conversation about colour, but it did return, and not just as a decorative, nor just as an explosive, just returned. And scatter. Scatter seemed to have returned. Inevitably, the second shop is opened in Taipei, with somewhat less pretension than in the Balls Pond. Sorry, it wasn't the Balls Pond, it was in Kingsland Road, wasn't it? The late Cedric Price used to love to use the reference to Balls Pond Road just because it's a silly name, but Kingsland Road is really where it's at, as you know. The Taipei shop actually got the model a bit better because it was more active, more scruffy, and immediately became a mecca for the sort of undiscovered, but rather interesting. In fact, there really is a rather interesting undiscovered group of people in Taipei, and this became their centre. So in a sense, the AA, its embassy in Taipei, became the place to be, and inevitably the place to import from. Objects seem to return to the AA, perhaps on the back of this admixture of things. Another person I have to introduce you to is Joe Kawasaki. He of one of those curious bits of parentage involving the occupation of Taipei by the Japanese. But he's a SciArc guy, so it's all right. Not really need to get worried about that. Very energetic, you see. This mixture of the Japanese and the Chinese and the SciArc and the whole thing is a wonderful energeticness. And immediately his challenge, or his psychological challenge in his head, is towards the European and East Coast position, of which he sees both people like Hank and Lisa as in a sense representing. He's irritated by this, and perhaps if you know more about him, you know why. I mean, he does all the usual things. He sits in on crits, but actually he comes from a city that had a serious earthquake. He's actually suffered earthquakes. He knows deconstruction at the nub end, so to speak. And there's no question that this can lead to a certain kind of architecture, or it can return back upon itself. Certainly his instincts are to be creative with it. And in no way is he philosophically a deconstructivist. His own drawings are curious mixtures and show a cute but muddled mind. But on the back of this, because he is a charismatic character in his own way, there begins to be another strange conversation that has returned, almost imperceptibly. All these things happen almost imperceptibly. There's a personality that you can point to, but there are things happening in the wake of or because of, in contradistinction to sometimes. There is, through the connection of Hank, there is a discussion of drawing by proportion of Vitruvius again, and of considering buildings as concerned with format. There is even a sort of Dalibor revival. There is even a sort of, shall we say, heroic, Gothic kind of atmospheric revival. And there is serious discussion of the role of drawing, of the role of depiction. I won't just call it drawing with the finger on the end, but the business of depiction in creative terms, because it is significant, is it not, that there are territories alongside or outside our own which deal with motion, with time, with content, with position, with structure, with quantity, with dynamic, but they're bloody awful drawings by our standards. They haven't come out beautifully from the machine or even from a beautifully wrought hand, but they do the thing. They do the thing more energetically, more unself-consciously than what we do. That kind of conversation seems to return. Or there are drawings which are to do with the making of things happening. Very straightforward drawings that are necessary in order for a building, let us say, to respond in an environment, for example. And in the wake of this, again almost willy-nilly, there is a kind of drawing and then a making of circumstances which cannot be drawn. The making of ghosts. The making of ghosts, the notion that the presence of the object or the presence of the situation is an almost untouchable passing presence. And meanwhile, the whole question of the role of the studio, of the project, of the task, of research, of the workshop tradition even, starts to move in, because the important thing is what you're trying to discover. Whether that can be mechanized, whether it can even be captured at all. And Finsterlin, in the wake of all this discussion, I suppose revolving around drawing, certainly, Finsterlin is rediscovered as the real daddy of surface and ameliorative shapes. The notion of substance and insubstance is essential. Well, it's all getting cozy again, isn't it? You can see how all these things fit terribly well together. But we are in England. We sometimes forget, certainly in this room, that we are in England, that we are, as I used to say of the A, that it is an aircraft carrier poised conveniently in an American-speaking location off Europe. But one doesn't say that today, does one? But nonetheless, and you get funny people on juries sometimes. If you have proper juries, if you have really, really proper juries, not these anodyne ones where everybody's very polite and they all know each other, but funny ones where somebody slopes in, and you get funny English slave. Maybe she's found in the bar one evening after, she say, "Come on, a jury." She doesn't. She's brilliant. In a funny, mumsy way, absolutely charismatic. Dawn Roberts. Nobody's much heard of her, but she's good. She's really... Otto has a nose for people, even people like Dawn, who he probably wouldn't want to spend the evening with, but nonetheless can recognise as having real... And Dawn's and so she finds her way onto the faculty, and her preoccupation is with a sort of the question of control and landscape, perhaps, but really deep down, she's a romantic. There's all that funny old English romantic stuff sitting there. endlessly and embarrassing. I mean, can you imagine? Even the delightful Joe, who's a nice guy, you know, wouldn't hurt a fly, but he has difficulty with this stuff. And as for Hank and Lisa, I mean, they just run a mile when they see Dawn in her old raincoat coming on a second, third glass of wine. Nonetheless, there is, of course, discoverably a certain recent tradition which is involved in other issues, worked through this curious territory of the English Romanticism. It's not to be thrown away. You know, the A is in England, but is insulated from it. And I ask the question, should it be? Or is it the English tradition of talking just asleep at the moment? There's a wonderful English tradition of talking about architecture, talking round architecture, and I am a great supporter of it. I suspect Otto is too. I think that he has a penchant for it, but again he coerces it in gently. He doesn't sort of say, now we're all going to have much different juries and I'm going to get all my funny old English friends in. No, that's far too crude. But it emerges. There's a wonderful notion that certain things can, of course, emerge. There is a kind of danger is this cloying Englishness. This is a drawing by a man called John Piper, who those who have studied Cedric Price's drawings carefully would actually note there's more than a little of John Piper in them. But I digress for the benefit of three people here who are grinning. More John Piper, indeed, and a certain kind of English suburban dream, which has also had a recent tradition of legitimacy in another place not far from here. Well, that has always a danger of getting cosy. And I introduce Arturo Schneider. Arturo has such a strange name because he's Chilean, and those of you will know that many Chileans are of German origin, of course, but have Latin, or, you know, Spanish mothers or whatever it may be. He is from Valparaiso. In fact, he was a child of a coupling that occurred in the School of Architecture at Valparaiso, particularly in the formative days of the Open City. Now, the Open City is this wonderful, strange construct that sits on various pieces of land outside Valparaiso, where the architect, and I think it still does, the architecture school infiltrated this landscape. Somebody, exact story. And there are these wonderful buildings, and you see Arturo finding himself in London, finding himself somehow inveigled into this, starts looking at this English romantic stuff and saying, wait a minute, I can't do the accent, but wait a minute, he's saying, you know, this is all too coy, too local, too romantic. We came from a natural situation, and we bloody built there in an extremely direct, marvellously inventive way. And there he is in the bank, remembering the banqueting lodge, and comparing it in his mind with the kind of, you know, the potential of that curious romantic English mix. But still, perhaps, then when comparing it with the House of Names in the same Open City, saying, no, it's what, you know, there is the place for romance, but there's also the place for doing and crafting. And yet he's a very, very young and curiously modern guy. What of this English escapist dream, and what of other precious put on? He remembers as a small kid going up the river in a place called Comarhuinam to a thing called the Almeida vessel. As a small kid being taken, there was this extraordinary object that was neither boat nor house, but invention, but pier, but infiltration, and place where the students were, for Christ's sake. And he says, well, we'll go to the A's country house and maybe, find a lake. But I don't want to get pulled into that, he says. And he works on and influences students to also wrap and pull the bulrushes around themselves. Before I introduce a further friend, I think it's of course inevitable, and Otto is very aware of this, that there will be alliances of these people and fallings out, and it can be manipulated. There are also other alliances. The school doesn't rest and mustn't rest, and he's also aware there's something else going on in London that isn't within an architecture school at all, nor within an institution. There seems to be a funny group of people also meeting in Kingsland Road, but not in the shop, but across the street, an old tyre depot. Some funny renegade. I mean, the School of Architecture at Cambridge, of course, having dissolved, has been partly imported by the A and other places. And there's some renegades from that connection, some renegades from the Bartlett, from Metropolitan, and from the A, meeting up in Kingsland Road and saying, there are other ways of doing it. Otto's smart enough to keep his ear to the ground and grabs the best of them for the faculty. It's the obvious thing to do. Buy it in. The London resource does exist. Sven Pistoia, this is Sven Pistoia, nobody quite knows what his passport is actually. Was he Swedish or was he Italian, or was it did he make up the name? He also seems to come from SIARC, curiously, but didn't seem to know the other guy. Sven which of course can happen at SIARC, terribly easily. He's a good observer, is Sven. He follows he's followed the tendencies, he's morphed, and he's woven. And he's then begun to also remember recent histories that not just the morphing and the weaving, but perhaps that technologies can be involved in the morphing and the weaving. And why not? Well, ha! It's getting a bit heavy, all this. These guys, they're existing in this. There's another series of explosive juries. And why not? And why not? Sven carries on, as such people do, into not very pretty, but inflatable buildings of a certain kind, because this is, in a sense, the natural corollary of the technical and the operational. He looks into the territory beyond materiality, into perhaps theatre. And Otto, from time to time, realizes that what is really important is the making as well as the production through the computer, or the production through the hand, or the chit-chat. It is, in his view, absolutely essential that the workshop must be in the building. Nowhere else, not up the road and down by the garage, in the building. The workshop, a necessary hub. The workshop in the tradition of materialization. And this tradition linked to life as is really happening, that the A can actually engage in real things. That's useful because it's quite soon after this time invited to design all the mobile kiosks for pret-a-manger, which is, a bit commercial, but what the hell? Why not? The bits can be scattered. And there is a certain tradition for this too, that just at the moment when Reiser and Omamoto's work is totally out of fashion, some of these guys realized that actually it was critical to this bringing together, that the Wellington bomber in Jesse Reiser's conversation is not a gratuitous reference. Another friend somehow, probably from hanging out, and he really doesn't look like an AA type. He cannot possibly have but in fact he was. Somebody who graduated from AA in some distant period and disappeared back to Wales. Because Daffyd Rhys-Williams, as he is in fact, is not only Celtic, he's almost professionally Celtic. He's almost horrifyingly Celtic. He's a Celtic romantic of the worst and most lovable kind. The students most intrigued by him, of course, are the Koreans and the Austrians. Absolutely fascinated by the Celtic link. Of course, what else would they be? Well, he's a bit of a ruralist, but not. He flips in a curious, localized kind of way. His flipping is to move away from the Celtic lands and to be absolutely fascinated by the Norfolk Broads, the wetlands, from which he did not come, but with which he wishes to engage. Of course, there's a little bit of connection there. If you remember the Valparaiso boat, he has a kind of hidden ally. That this territory, and after all, there then becomes a legitimate conversation around the place that with global warming and increasing numbers, not only Venetian floods, but even Hackney floods, etc., getting rather close to home, that, bugger it, why don't we do something about it in the aim? Why not? And groups of students are regularly taken out on the Norfolk Broads and have a very good time. And other students go back to Daffyd's old territory of the Welsh mountains and do extraordinary things on it. And there is, of course, a legitimate tradition for the notion of the morphing between the solid, the unsolid, the buildable, the non-buildable, the husbanded territory and the non-husbanded. And even if you dig around, you find that Greg Lynn has been there. So that's all right. In fact, Greg Lynn, at a certain point, on the back of this conversation, because he's getting bored with the other conversations, Otto woos Greg away from the Angewandte to the AA. Why not? It mixes curious sort of local tradition also. And so there are increasingly, not just the big formal juries, but increasingly lots of funny little testing things, little sort of juriettes, little conversations here, earnest people, scruffy people, and Otto listening in very often. There is a curious side effect of this, because there is what I would call the melancholy of the specific. Whilst we keep non-specific, we can keep delighted, intense, bland, academic. When we become specific, there's always the danger, or there's the opportunity that we can put into it personality of the place, of the substance, of the experience. And inevitably there is the possibility of melancholia. What's going on with all this? And what does Lisa think about it? And you remember her background, you remember her approach. How is she handling all of these cross-currents? It ain't exactly where she came from. And how is she a barometer of the AA? Because she is very much an AA person, as you would know of at this moment. What is she doing? How is she reacting? Is she still managing to keep her Dutch-German cool? Not quite. She's flipped. Embarrassingly, perhaps. It's either the most embarrassing flip that you could ever imagine, or is it in fact her extremely bourgeois background that she's been suppressing up on the hills behind Frankfurt? Or is it in fact an extremely sophisticated provocation? Is she in fact the cleverest of the lot? Is she provoking in extremely arch way, drawing out the fangs of the rest of the sea? Will we ever know? Or is there, in fact, a new bourgeoisism, or a reaction to Hank's hard academicism? The problem is that, of course, she and Hank are inevitably attracted to each other and have this sort of parrying of projects while at the same time having this extreme sexual attraction. And that is part of it, and why not? The return of a certain fragmentism seems to happen as a byproduct. A return or an application of certain surfaces that can be morphed, but to specific conditions, without melancholy. There is the urban infiltration. And curiously enough, Lisa and Hank and Joe cooperate on a whole series of urban projects. They resolve this thing in moving up to another scale that perhaps can either accommodate all of their personal positions or is indeed some more of the three. Makes for wonderful, wonderful crits and studio conversations. And the New York AA shop inevitably then is of a much, much more intriguing and interesting nature than the other two. It hasn't ended with the self-consciousness of the other two. It goes with it. By now there's a real spirit and a real amazing creativity around the place. Now, what has happened to the old students left from the early 2000s? And some of whom are also on the faculty. These guys have returned to be on the faculty. They remember years like 2001, 2002, 2003. Come back moist and all is forgiven. These guys, they say, who are these people? They're turning this place into something strange and frighteningly creative. What's happened? Another of those events. My God, yes, it's getting good right now. They're getting really good. It's happening on every corridor. Well, sometimes there's a return to the old normalcy, the old calm, the old circumspection, but not for long. And perhaps, and how long can one go on with this unending story? There is always a period of recongealing, but hopefully continual periods of rediscovering, re-explosion, and recombining. My thinking is that what has to be avoided, though it was heroic, is conformity. Here we see, well, of course, it's the famous Texas Rangers. Well, the Texas Rangers are hunt out Mr. Seligman and Mr. Rowe and other such people. I think you had a seminar on that the other day. But they're hidden amongst these chaps. They're not really allowed to do more, certainly not in the photograph. Some of them look distinctly worried. They're about to be fired. Or there is another kind of, get them to do something, conformity. The guys at the Bauhaus wanted to be energetic, but as long as they were energetic in a certain kind of a way, and their masters, meanwhile, even the lady has a hat, rather like those of the blokes. Or there is that rather enjoyable, in historical terms, to see a certain conformity. We on the one hand say, yes, must not the Moscow Academy, the Moscow Academy have been absolutely marvellous place in 1923. But was it also a rather sterile place in a certain kind of way in 1923? I pose that question. There's an edge of me. There have been attempts, of course, there's always the attempt to say, no, we are from a certain centre and we will broaden it. This is a moment in the history of the Angewandte in Vienna, probably about 3 years ago, and Wolf Prix is trying to open up. Most of the people he opens up to are locals, except there is a bit of a maverick top right, Levius Woods. How the hell, glass in hand, how the hell he got in there, we're not quite sure. So it's a step in the right direction, but it's not enough. There have, of course, been moments in the history of this city, and I'm taking an old example from the 70s, at which the whole point was that about the coveting of the eccentric, the drawing attention to the difference between the one and the other. Or you could even go as far as we have done up the road at the Bartlett, where you take a perfectly respectable Tyrolean, albeit an Italian Tyrolean, and you then play upon his desperate wish that he's carried with him for years to wear animals on his head. And then, in fact, pursues it in 4 years of PhD thesis writing, which is nearly finished. And why not? Or one can gather together, as I did in Venice recently, a number of disparate people, some of whom are trying to hide from the camera, and enjoy their disparateness. Ultimately, of course, the question is that the teacher should learn from his students. This is the most magic part of the whole operation. I think the A has to remember some of the key aspects of its potential. Its internationalism, of course, and its networking, of course, and to always not just use the old systems of networking, but much more subtle systems. It must also remember its tradition of entrepreneurship, which is why I introduced this rather banal shop metaphor. And it must remember that it does have and must continue to have style. It should rediscover the benefits of what I loosely would call English chat, which is more a way of discussing rather than what accent you have. It's a way of moving around the discussion of architectural matters. Which is closely psychologically, philosophically linked to the business of invention, which I think is also absolutely central to any, how can I describe it, any aspiring school of architecture. What I've discussed might be very, very crudely described here in a diagrammatic form, the business of consolidation from time to time and mixes, and the blue sort of boxes at the far end is this very necessary thing, as I know from the last many years' experience, that this has to be recognized, that students don't want to come and do some lovely experiment and then not get anything for it. They need to be externally credible. You need to be able to put your hand in your pocket and take out something, if it's not a credit card, which is the equivalent of a credit card. So this somehow the task facing Otto is also the task of making it readable from the outside, making it viable academically, and I use the term academically in its best sense, making it a marketable credit card. And that it must have the subtlety and sensitivity to recognize the sniff in the air. One has said on many occasions, there's something in the air, there's something in the air, there's something in the air. What is the alternative? One alternative is even greater, is an even more free-form situation. Everybody's running around. And Otto isn't sort of looking sufficiently over his or her shoulder. And the purpose of then trying to find accreditation for it is extremely difficult. That you're sort of running, actually chasing moonbeams the whole time. But then the other alternative is perhaps even more tedious, where there is a consolidation. You believe that you have a very reasonable, worthy, recent tradition, that it moves on very nicely, that you consolidate it, you allow some new faces to come in, but really you want them to become very rapidly absorbed into the thing that you already have. It's very easy, of course, to make it have a credit card to it. Very easy to say, this is our product, it's saleable, isn't it? And a few years down the line, it's sterile, it's lost it. Why not have a school of schools? This is a very crude diagram suggesting that the blue school not just a unit, a school. The blue school can exist in contradistinction to the yellow school. And the green school, though more modest, in contradistinction again. And that the system must be sensitive enough to listen for the progress, increased progress of the red school. And what is the grey one? Perhaps its birth is in the AA, but that it takes off elsewhere, linked perhaps, but not necessarily within the body of the institution. And there's a purple one at the bottom, which is actually anyhow outside, but very much part of the system. And even the box, even the accreditation system must have antennae, it must have sensing to pick up and to be able to put into that marketability what is sensed, and sensing the other way to feel what might happen in time. It was the rule of this evening not to show any of one's work. I'm breaking it only really in the last slide because I want to draw an analogy between this building and the School of Schools. The Graz building had to deal with an inherited footprint, had to deal with a very specific, even sometimes constraining footprint against which it was pushing, but enjoying the push, enjoying the sexiness of the push. It had to deal and absorb what was actually the English tradition, because the old building on the left there was actually made in Sheffield and shipped out with the new English tradition, the English chat, if you like. And the historically radical element, which is almost like a piece of, I admit it, of re-employed constructivism, was there as a reminder of the continuity of modernism and the responsivity of the skin and the mystery that it could contain within. Again, I feel there's a strong analogy with the school. The nozzles point correctly to the north, except for the naughty nozzle. And there should always be a naughty nozzle. That's it. Yes, sure.
Are there any questions? Well, maybe, kind of while you're thinking a question up, I was worried about the fate of your characters. I mean, you didn't kind of quite finish off now. As you remember, in the middle of towards the end of George Bush's second term, there was that terrible collapse of the dollar and the yen, and unfortunately the AA had to close. And it was at the time when it reverted to being a domestic house for Cherry Blair. And you may recall that all those people suddenly, well, as everyone at the AA, suddenly had to start thinking about getting a real job. As far as I recall, all those characters applied for the Bartlett. And I've never known to this day which one you gave a reference to.
I think I had to give the reference to Otto because he was out of a job. They were out of a job, but they were probably younger and were still discovering where they would go. But I think I have a slight. I think the most intriguing character, nonetheless, and the one that one is sort of attracted to, is obviously Lisa. Because in a sense she is of the A, she came from the A now. And she looks in a sense rather straight up and down. She looks, of a type, say yes, of course that's a smart, attractive German lady and she will survive anywhere. In fact, she is the one who undergoes the greatest metamorphosis. The English lady with the glass and the Celtic. I mean, they have she and perhaps the Sayat guy. I think the American will be all right. He can retreat into his book, you know, even in a croft in Scotland or wherever it might be. But those guys, those other guys are fragile because they are so dependent upon a hothouse situation. And it's not just a question of being short of cash, it's being sort of not having a hothouse within which to exist. I think that is a perennial concept.
But I think everyone was surprised that Hank ended up in an architectural school in North Korea. But even more surprised to discover that there was a huge underground interest in North Korea in the early Archigram.
Ah, yes. Well, it's probably where they're doing it. There's always an underground, and it's curious where there is and there isn't an underground. And I think that we sit here in a very privileged city, in a very privileged place, in a very privileged city, and we consider ourselves part of the overground. You know, we're heard, we're published, we're fancy, we have projectors at work and all of that sometimes. And in a way, the underground is always the place where the thing will be generated. You know, all the 60s was actually the child of the 50s. And I think what is going on in here is probably the child of things that were dreamed up in a number of other places. So that if you turn the thing back as a loop, it's rather interesting. Some people will survive, and others, I think, will need the hothouse. Whether we can invent other kinds of hothouse, but it hasn't happened very often. I mean, the number of new hothouses that emerge is and I return then to the sort of quasi-dry bit at the beginning, you know, that architectural education is extremely fragile, frighteningly fragile, and that hot houses, dry houses, or wet houses, any kind of conducive houses, they're so rare. I think that almost interests me. Well, yes, the economic thing gets us all, but I think that really interests me. Who can survive where, and who goes back? And it's fascinating to meet one's ex-students in all the places that you know, do they revert to type or don't they, or do they, or can they never? You know that you could argue that in the best cases you render them unable to revert to type. And it's only the dumb ones who revert to type. But it's not as simple as that. It's actually much more complex than that. And to see, I remember my very worst AA student ever, who I think it took us 4 goes to get through, inviting me to Cyprus for a large fee, and so I went. And indeed, his business card had the AA crest, the largest I have ever seen it on anybody's business card. And when I got the phone call, he said his name. I thought, can't be that guy. He can't be the president of the Cypriot whatever. But he was, and it was the same guy. And then, you know, I was stuck there on an island, and I had to go and see all his buildings. And in fact, they were as bad as they had been in the AA. But on the other hand, our most brilliant ever morph between East London and the Bartlett was also a Cypriot lady who, after picking up every medal as it's possible to get in the UK, went and disappeared into Cyprus. He has appeared and she has disappeared. So one has to somehow be creatively cynical. I'm a great believer in creative cynicism. You know, cynicism is normally thought of as a negative. I think that it can be extremely amusingly useful. Or have I gone abstract on our storytelling?
It's a bit theoretical for us. I mean,
no, a bit theoretical for the okay. Sorry about that.
Other contributions?
Hi, this unpredictability, is it something essential to keeping our strength as opposed to becoming fragile? And when I pose this question is, there's a lot of units within the school, if not all, year in and year out. They're very predictable with their brief and what they're going to do. Is that causing us a problem, and should we change that?
I don't know. I'm not in your school, but it sounds like it might be, yes?
The difficulty of the AA is distinguishing between the unpredictable and the totally unreliable.
I mean, what's if I can be autobiographical, is fascinating is to see how people do morph. I mean, my scenarios are not actually that off the wall. They're a little bit exaggerated, but not very much. There are lots of cases of people who do flip at a certain point in their career and actually construct or live amongst that which they were totally brought up. But there's somewhere if you could pin it, you know, and the notion as to whether Lisa was actually being provocative or was returning to her roots in some bizarre way remains as a question mark in my mind, and might even remain a question mark in her mind, because you can't distinguish the one from the other. The degree to which an extreme experience, whether it might be an earthquake is an easy one to find in photographs, but I love this machine. The degree to which it actually could affect, you know, one's creative work intrigues me. It's a little bit arch, but not that much. You do discover that there were certain strange things that happened to people, and it caused them, if they're strong, it caused them to actually benefit. It caused them to actually play with their paranoia, make out of their paranoia an actually forward creative thing. But you're somebody who comes. You know more about that stuff than I do. I'm only a bloody architect, but. It does intrigue me and you do get these strange morphs, you know, because two people who would seem to be on opposite sides of an intellectual or tectonic firing line are personally attracted to each other, and allows all sorts of strange things to happen, usually to benefit, sometimes ending in something worse than the Jerry Springer show. But
Okay, well, possibly to get this conversation going, we need to migrate upstairs to the bar. And actually, this evening, I'm not going to kind of, in some ritual way, thank you for the lecture, because that's actually not what's been at stake. I'm sure, like many of you here, the experience is precisely of having been given a gift, which you've done, and I'd like to acknowledge the generosity that lies behind it.
thank you. Oh, proper drink now.